I had prepared this topic on genes. Genes explain better these ancestral beliefs. Spirituality can be perceived easily through science. They are codes, tiny codes that program something into instructing it as to how it should develop and when, how, the timing. You can never find a gene on sound on your foot, and genes are inherited. Now we're getting to the topic. Woo! Been waiting for this part. So that's how trauma is passed on. We're like, I'm changing my genetic code, I'm never going near that. Then that gene is passed on. You eat something, you like it, you're like, I love strawberries. Then that gene is passed on, right? In the past, human beings were bisexual. And as time went by, energy felt that being touched by somebody else feels good. I'm not bisexual anymore. Which means that my grandmother's memories are now expressing themselves in me. Hi guys, welcome back. We're back again after the video of the interview. I'm so sorry to everybody out there who doesn't understand Siswati, but just a summary, which is talking about the importance of knowing your background as an individual, your racial and ethnical background as an individual. He knew basic principles on how these procedures were done and why they were done and what happens when these procedures were not done to you as a baby. So we're basically unfolding those. Yes, I'm also wearing myself today. If you're interested in buying these or learning how to do them, just DM us in these handles. So I came back home because I am having a severe toothache. Ooh, you don't want to have a toothache. If you once experienced labor pains, it's some sort of like labor pains, but it's a bit sharper than labor pains and it doesn't give you rest. It's just sharp, consistent pain. Ooh, I feel like screaming, so I might be screaming once in a while. Don't be shocked. So I may just go like here and there. Okay, so today I had prepared this topic on genes, right? If you remember my previous video, I stated this, that my next video would be about genes. And when this guy was touching on ancestors and how ancestors work, I was so shocked because genes explain better these ancestral beliefs and what Africans meant when they say that your ancestors should be appeased, or your ancestors are always guiding you and showing you the way and giving you a heads up wherever you may be facing a problem. These are just genes. These guys are just talking about genes, genetics. Okay, I missed that from the top, right? I'm a scientist. I love how I always state this. It's so funny. Okay, but then, truth be told, I'm a scientist. And I believe that spirituality can be better explained and perceived by the canal mind or the physical mind through science. Spirituality can be perceived easily through science, right? So, genes, genetics. The first person, for example, the first person didn't know what pain was, right? And let me just put it like this. The first organism was a unicellular organism, right? I will talk about energy. I know I've been promising you this. I sound like a broken record, but I will talk about energy someday. So energy has this purpose to just propel itself forward, evolve without going extinct. In the process, it wants to live comfortably. Energy always finds ways to evolve into better comfortability, right? So this cell developed itself and split. As it was living in this environment, it decided, no, this environment is cold, I want to be warmer, right? So it then developed this program in it that, okay, if I want to get warm, I need to secrete this kind of a juice, right? So it developed a program, juice secretion of warmth, right? So that's how the cell became warm, right? And it divided itself again. And as it divided itself, it was like, you know what, I need to get to that plant. So in order to get to that plant, I need to develop something that can help me move from point A to point B, right? So it started developing limbs. They were shorter, and then it was like, no, they're too short, I need to get the faster. Then it developed itself to have longer limbs, developed to have more than one limbs, to reach into things, to walk, to touch, to right, to grab and all that. Okay, so I will also talk about evolution. I'm just touching base on evolution and energy right now. So every time this thing decided to evolve into something better, it would develop a program that will make it do this thing, right? Like, okay, I need a program to develop a limb, right? And then the limb will develop, right? And once it's developed, you need a program that will instruct that limb to move from one step to another, and how, right? So this thing is extremely deep. Genetics are extremely deep and very, very complex, because they're codes, tiny codes that program something into instructing it as to how it should develop and when, how, the timing, right? Everything, right? That's a gene, right? So, since the beginning of time, human beings had this thing in them that was just striving to be better and be comfortable in the process, right? Called genes. On the skin, we have genes that program the skin, produce melanin, which means that you have a darker skin, produce this amount of fat and deposit them here, right? So we'll have a skin that is bulging like that, like determining your shape and all that, right? You will have these size of pores, follicle type to produce your hair. These genes on the skin, each and every gene has its job, right? You can never find a gene on the skin that will tell the skin to move, how to move from point A to point B, right? You will find that gene on your feet. The genes found on your feet, in fact at the bottom of your feet, will tell your foot on how to grab the ground, how to avoid slippery, right? In your ear, how to detect sound, how to absorb sound, how to balance off the head structure, right? You can never find a gene on sound on your foot, right? So that's how genes are. Genes are just these tiny codes that instruct that kind of cell in a particular organ to carry out its function in a specific way, right? And genes are inherited. Now we're getting to the topic. Woo! Been waiting for this part. Now that we know what genes are, how they're formulated, and why, right? So the first person now is a complete human being with full limbs, eyes, everything functioning like you and I, right? The first ever human beings, let's say human beings, right? So this human being A, falls into fire, right? Dies. Human being B is observing that. The empathy gene, the gene that feels another person's pain without feeling it directly, picks that up and is like, oh no, I'm afraid of that. Legit afraid of that. Which means that when human being B gives birth to his or her offsprings, they will carry this gene of being afraid of fire. They've never experienced it firsthand, but they're just cautious around fire. Their parent never experienced it firsthand. He or she saw another person going through that. Imagine if human being A catches fire, right? doesn't die, sustains third-degree burns, maybe, then that person would have experienced this thing directly, which means that the trauma that this person will pass on to his or her offsprings will be much higher than the trauma passed on by a human being B to his or her offsprings, right? So that's how trauma is passed on, right? It's just a genetic code. We see, we're like, I'm changing my genetic code. I'm never going near that, right? Then that gene is passed on, right? You eat something, you like it, you're like, I love strawberries, right? Then that gene is passed on, right? So, the interesting part, we are now multicellular beings, right? In the past, human beings were bisexual, right? They would reproduce on their own, impregnate themselves, and have babies on their own, which means that the gene that was possessed by this individual will be passed directly onto the next generation, right? Which means the next generation would look exactly like the parent, right? And as time went by, energy felt that being touched by somebody else feels good. So, you know what? I'm not bisexual anymore, right? So this sexuality was lost as we moved along, depending on which type of sexual organ this person enjoyed using, right? We'll talk about evolution today. Let's not focus on that yet. Don't get confused. Just focus on this, what the point I'm trying to make. So then developed a male and a female human being, right? So now, in order to produce an offspring or the next generation, two different human beings come together to produce one human being, which means that the offspring that will be produced, the next generation will not be exactly the same with the with this previous generation, because now there are two types of codes, different experiences meeting to produce this one, right? So sometimes the mother would be more powerful or dominant. Her genes would be more dominant, right? Which means that the child or the offspring will look more the mother compared to the father, right? And sometimes there would be co-dominance, like both these parents are dominant, have dominant genes, right? Which means the baby will combine, both parents will have traits equally distributed, right, for both the mother and the father, right? So now unpacking this ancestral thing. People believe that ancestors are always with you. They are part of you. They're there to guide you and instruct you and to warn you and this and this and that. They're your spiritual guides, right? That's very true. But then they are personifying it, right? Just like religion personifies this whole God thing, right? They call God the Father so that the carnal mind can perceive it, right? Because when you think about, oh, a father is somebody who's there to protect me, take care of me, be there for me, and give me stuff whenever I ask for it, like guide me and do all that, right? The moment you talk about father, you think about that. But what about the one who's been abused by his or her father, you know? So that's the downfall of this thing of personifying spirituality. Even with this ancestral thing, these people are actually personifying it into saying they are my relatives, you feel me, like they're personifying it into they're humanifying it, right? Yet they're talking about the genes, right? My grandmother's gene is now dominant in me, right? Which means that my grandmother's memories are now expressing themselves in me, right? Because a gene, let's take an example, a gene that is responsible for pain, for processing pain in your mind, right? will definitely be passed on from generation to generation. That generation will relieve that trauma. The generation will relieve that trauma, even if it's not directly. Sometimes it will be very recessive to a certain individual, such that that person will not even relate to what you're talking about. Your sibling may say, oh my God, I'm afraid of water, because your grandmother may be drowned and survived, possibly. Your grandmother drowned and survived, and this trauma is extremely dominant. It's expressing itself unto you. You're still afraid of water because this gene remembers this drowning process, right? And it's extremely dominant on this sibling. On the next sibling, the gene is there, but it's recessive, right? There is a gene that is more dominant than it, right? Which means that this individual will just doesn't care about water, because this gene is not expressing itself on them, right? So this afraid of water gene, due to drowning in the past, expresses itself onto this one, right? Sometimes mostly in Africa, people would initiate, right, in some things. It is believed that, okay, it is known that the spiritual realm is extremely diverse, right? In the physical realm, we're only perceiving 1% of the whole universe. We cannot detect the X-ray, we cannot detect microwaves, we cannot detect beta waves, we cannot detect alpha waves. There are a lot of things we can't perceive with our minds, our carnal minds, and our we cannot perceive with our five senses and our carnal minds, right? So there are a lot of things that are happening in this realm, which, if we can tap into our initial selves, our cells, the first cell that existed in this universe, if we can tap to that first coding, first gene, we can know a lot of things pertaining the universe. So some people in the past cracked that secret, right? They tapped into their cell, their first cell, and when they told people about this, people did not believe it. They did not believe that you could see such things in this world, right? So those who were willing to learn or accept this information went to these people. They can be called shamans nowadays. They went to these people and asked for the wisdom, asked to be taken through, to be taught about this thing, as to how it is done, when and what to, right, for guidance, for to teach them and guide them, right? So this process was called initiating, because they were being initiated into this. They were being taught something new, out with the old and in with the new, right? Initiation, that's the process of initiating, right? So some of these people would initiate into these ancient knowledge and mystic understanding of the universe, right? So if this person initiates right now and gets the key to these secrets and knowledges, right, it means that his mind, his waves, his brain waves, they've attracted this information and stored it, right, into this gene that is responsible for memory, right? Which means that this person would give birth to some people, right? Maybe the gene, the memory gene, will be recessive in the next generation, but in one way or the other down the line, this gene will express itself, which means that the information that this person knew will come back as is. Then this person will be perceived as crazy, bipolar, ADHD, having all this, because this person cannot process what is happening in their minds. A lot, they know a lot of things they can't articulate in this physical realm, right? They are in conflict with their spirituality and physicality. hence these conditions of bipolars, ADHDs, and all these things, right? I will talk about awareness. I feel like now I'm falling more into awareness. I will talk about awareness as we move along, but I just want to put this forth that in this day and age, people don't want to understand things scientifically, in a scientific point of view. Every time somebody does something they do not understand, they either label it demonic or give it a medical a name of some sort, and they make sure that they put you on medication just to make you a zombie, to dump down your frequency and your mind so that you do not open your eyes into the realities, right? But then truth be told, genes are real, and there is nothing demonic about reliving experiences that were lived by your great grandparents. There is nothing wrong with that, because that gene that person had, maybe this gene is coming back as the skin gene, right? Which means that your nose will be shaped like your great grandmother, or you have your great grandmother's eyes, or anything, right? Also, mental genes do come back then. So if your grandmother had these and these so and so memories, they will manifest maybe 1,000 years later, but they will eventually manifest if you're in that person's lineage, right? So I feel like we should stop demonizing or labeling things we do not understand and try to study them further. Love and light.